I have top of the hour. Welcome, everyone. I am Rachel Paul with IAAP. Thank you for joining us today for our second webinar in the Strategic Leader in Accessibility series. Before we get started, just have a few items to go over today. All microphones are muted to prevent any background noise or disruptions. We do have closed captioning provided today, and in the chat is a link to a third-party streaming as well, and I'll repost that as soon as I'm done in case you missed it. Today's webinar is recorded and will be available on the IAAP YouTube channel, and if you missed last week's webinar, it is already up. I will also leave a link to our YouTube channel so you can access those afterwards. We ask that you try to leave all your questions in the Q&A box today and leave the chat for any general discussions and technical issues you may have with the webinar. As a reminder, if you're an IAAP member, you can continue the conversation and discussions in the Strategic Leader in Accessibility Community of Practice, which is hosted in our IAAP member connections. And if you're not a member and you're interested in finding out more, we will share the link where you can find out some more about membership and benefits, and we'd love to have you join us. And we are very excited today to have Kate Nash and David Caldwell with us to talk about partnership excellence. And I'm going to turn it over to David to introduce himself, and Kate. Thank you both for joining us.
Thanks, Rachel. Hello, everybody. My name's David. I currently work at the Home Office in the UK as the Head of Accessibility and Digital Inclusion. And I'm really pleased to be part of the Strategic Leader in Accessibility Working Group. Today, we're going to be focusing on one of the domains that is inside the Book of Knowledge and as part of the work that we've been doing. And the domain we're looking at is partnership excellence, and we're focusing specifically on disability staff networks. And I can think of nobody else in the world better qualified to talk about disability staff networks than Kate Nash. So Kate, hello, welcome. Give us a bit of an introduction.
Thank you, David. Well, look, a really great pleasure to be able to join you today. I was thoroughly excited to be able to join David in any conversation, but this, of course, is a subject so dear to my heart. So, as David said, I have the great pleasure of heading up Purple Space. It's a small social business, and we set up in 2015 as a result of a book that I wrote some years ago, Secrets and Big News. And now we have a growing membership. And what we do is to support organisations, employers to set up and or to improve the effectiveness of their employee resource groups or networks. And of course, there's such a crossover in terms of the wonderful work that Access champions and Access professionals are doing. So yeah, delighted to be here, David. I think my picture on my photo is short hair. I think COVID has now meant that we can't go to hairdressers, but it is me, and it's lovely to be with you. And I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Yeah, it's a really interesting topic, and I think that it's. I'm hoping that we've got lots of people on the call today who are up for asking us questions. I can see we've got over 100 attendees already. So if you do have questions for Kate or for me or about this topic in general, then please get them into the Q&A, and we will come round and get to them. We wanted to start today's session setting a bit of context about networks in the world that we live in right now. And Kate, I know that Purple Space, just before Christmas, around the International Day of Persons with Disabilities, launched their impact report that looked at this kind of networks in the world of COVID. I wondered, what are your kind of thoughts about that, and what are you seeing from networks around COVID, in particular around accessibility and accessing company systems remotely?
Yeah. Thank you. So a few things. I mean, in terms of the context of ERGs and networks, we're seeing massive growth. So, organizations, whether they're a global business or, a local business within a specific jurisdiction, we're increasingly seeing that they're becoming vehicles to accelerate the pace of change when it comes to disability confidence. So, as we know, most businesses or businesses of a certain size will have a diversity and inclusion professional specialist, and they often work across a really large brief in order to build a more inclusive workplace. And resource groups and networks are really used to augment and supplement and to really hasten the pace of change. So that's happening per se. In terms of COVID and some of the things that came out of the Impact working group, two things really struck me. One is that disability networks, ERGs, have meant that they're really good focal point in raising issues and surfacing challenges and spotting trends when it comes to access issues. So they're a really natural vehicle for surfacing those pre-existing challenges. And what COVID has done, and of course we've proven in an instant how easy it is for many of us to work remotely and from home. And this of course has been something that many disabled employees have been calling for many years. But we've now almost proven the point that it's relatively easy to be able to work extensively from home. Of course that brings challenges. So that's the first thing that really struck me, is how COVID has accelerated the surfacing of pre-existing challenges when it comes to the access requirements, not just of disabled people, but anyone who wants to become more proficient in using tech, become more productive and more efficient in their work. So that's the first thing. I think the second thing is they're often, and it really came through in the Impact report, David, I know you were part of the working group, but often networks and resource groups provide a very strong role in noticing the solutions. So lots of chat between and across disabled people, some of whom have the same impairments, some who will have different impairments, but they're often a rich source of advice and support as to how you can switch on certain features when it comes to access tech. And what we were seeing through COVID is often they were the go-to agent for organisations who wanted to really start to think about how you automate certain features within tech. So yeah, those are the first two things that struck me. What about you? What did you see from the Impact report?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's probably sort of similar to you. I think the way I summarised it when I was talking to some colleagues about the report and we were discussing it was, I think the thing that comes through a lot is that the impossible was made possible in an instant, and I think actually it's shown that the reluctance to do some adjustments was there, has been there for a long time, but in some way unjustifiably. And I think that sometimes it just takes these big events to happen to shake things up a little bit. What I liked in what you were saying was about how networks are that conduit for those sort of issues bubbling up. And I suppose I wonder what you see in that kind of being that conduit, about the role of network leaders in speaking that truth to power, and being the voice for those that they represent in the organization. What's your thoughts there? What's your thoughts in terms of how networks can do that?
I think one of the strongest roles that they play is in clustering the common themes that come out of inaccessible tech, as well as inaccessible environment, as well as inaccessible ways in which we work. And we often know, the reality is most people with a disability are individuals who acquire that health condition or disability through the course of their working life. We know that some 84% of all disabled people are those people who acquire their disability from the ages of 16 and 65. And what that means is people are often grappling with a change of identity, as well as often a change in the way in which they have to work, and a change in the way in which they interface with their working environment, as well as the people who work around them. And it can be incredibly hard to accommodate and feel good, and, you know, to feel good about yourself within that change of identity. And therefore it becomes very complex and harder and longer for individuals to articulate what their needs are. One of the things that we saw, for example, in the book that we wrote years ago, is it can take on average someone 2 to 3 years to even ask for a workplace adjustment, because they feel that they are favours. You know, we know on the one hand that these things are not favours, they're enshrined in law, but it's altogether different. So to come back to your question, I think what networks and ERG do so powerfully is that they provide what I'd call an advocate type role. They start to surface the themes and the constant truths around inaccessible tech or environments, and they start to depersonalize the need to provide solutions for groups of people who might share the same impairment. So whether that's individuals with a visual impairment, or people with who are maybe have a hearing condition, they are theming those things rather than an individual having to ask for a particular workplace adjustment. And it's just accelerated that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think some interesting comments. There was an interesting comment from Ray around people are being taught to be grateful for what you do have and not to ask for too much. And I think I've definitely seen that. You know, I've definitely seen disabled staff go, well, you know, I got this bit of the, you know, I got one of the 10 things that I needed, and I kind of felt bad for asking for more. So yeah, I've seen that. I also, just on Tracy's point, ERG is employee resource group. So we tend to talk about employee networks, employee resource groups. There's a whole plethora of different ways of saying the same thing, isn't there, Kate?
Yes, absolutely. Different organisations will use different language to describe often the same thing. As David says, the most common used languages are networks or employee resource groups, but equally see some organisations use the term business resource groups, sometimes special interest groups, sometimes affinity groups. And particularly when it comes to this subject, you often have accessibility networks or user testing groups as well. So it's really vehicles of individuals who don't have a dedicated role in mainstreaming disability within the workplace, but are individuals who want to support their business to do differently and better. And yes, Ray's point, it's so well put. Absolutely. Those people who feel sometimes gratitude, which is easily felt, but really, you know, it's about being expectant about your organisation to want to provide something that means you can do your job.
Definitely, yeah, and I think it's a difficult thing to overcome as well, isn't it? Because it's so deeply ingrained in so many of us, and I think in particular, you know, people with disabilities, because of for a lot of the time the journey that they've been on of like you say, self-acceptance, and then you know, the challenges of getting support both in the workplace and outside the workplace. I wanted to pick up a little bit on one of the things that you just mentioned there about the kind of the informal role of networks, in as much as, you know, most network leaders and most networks are volunteer led. You know, there's a very few examples where it's, you know, it's a formal part of somebody's job. What challenges do you see with that in terms of those network leaders' role when it comes to this topic of accessibility and but, you know, both digital accessibility, workplace accessibility in general? What kind of impact does that have, that these people, you know, these people have got a big remit, but they are volunteers?
Yeah, and there lies the rub. You know, one of the great things that ERG leaders and network leaders have in abundance, we see, is passion, energy, commitment, dedication, and a real desire to support their organisation to do differently and better. They're very often individuals who've experienced disability themselves in one way or another. Often that's direct experience, but it's equally can be somebody who may be a parent of a child with a disability, or indeed someone whose parents had a disability. It may be individuals who are line managers, etc. So, but you're absolutely right. They also have a day job, you know, and the day job comes first. So I suppose the greatest role, the greatest benefits that networks can play is in clustering some of the themes and the common features of inaccessibility for disabled people, but their roles are naturally very broad. You know, they're often involved in supporting an organisation to improve their workplace adjustment policy. They're often involved in delivering storytelling campaigns, which you know so much about yourself, David. And they're also can be involved in user testing groups, but their roles are very, very broad. And I think where some of the networks that are led by some of the accessibility leaders and the unique role that accessibility leaders can play is a real focus on the access issues, because they're slightly different. You know, disability is a complex human experience, and for some it's about leveling the playing field when it comes to kit and gizmos, technical terms. But sometimes it's not about that. Sometimes it's about noticing the self-limiting and truths that we have of ourselves and the things that we need to do to improve our confidence. So yeah, but to answer your question, ERG leaders are busy bunnies. They have a very broad remit. Some of that is about access, but if that can be augmented by great leadership when it comes to access champions, then that's fantastic. That's when the magic happens.
Yeah. Absolutely. I'm going to pick up a couple of comments up and questions, just because I think some of these are really relevant. So Ray talks about the use of the term employee business partner, which actually it's the first time I've seen that, and I'm really enjoying that sense of what he's saying in terms of it being working in partnership with the rest of the organization to create that productive and kind of inclusive environment. I can see how that language is really helpful. So yeah, that's a great contribution there, Ray. We've got a couple of questions around workplace adjustment, asking for adjustments and helping people to talk about their disability in the workplace. I know this is a topic of conversation that you often come up against in terms of, how do we encourage people to tell us about their disabilities, and then how do we encourage them to ask for adjustments to make sure that they are best supported in the workplace. And I've got some thoughts, but I'd love to hear yours first.
Yeah, well, I think some of the more common ways in which you can support people, I suppose, to hasten the process by which they ask for a workplace adjustment is to really give good, consistent and easily visible information about how you can access the workplace adjustment. Those employers that really start to motor on this are those that tend to have, a one-stop portal of information that's very visible. It can be available as you onboard an organisation. Senior business leaders know where it is and tend to socialise that information with their own teams. Both human resources and the D&I departments will routinely get information about where you can get that access adjustment. So that's really, really important. I think the other thing that networks can do to support people to know that a business is really serious in wanting to deliver adjustments is some of the storytelling campaigns. Many organisations, whether they're very small, public sector organisations in a locale, or whether they're large global multinationals, one of the most powerful instruments of change is to get individuals to share information about their disability, and not just for its sake. It's not a cathartic exercise. It's about saying, this is me, this is my impairment, this is what I do for the business, this is how I deliver well for the business, and by the way, I have bipolar. And mine is a good news story, because as soon as I asked, I was able to get a soft adjustment in terms of how I work. And those little micro stories have the most powerful impact in helping people to notice, wow, the business is really serious about this.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on that, David?
Well, so I think on the first question around, how do you help staff to know that that they can get adjustments, I think we need to just make sure that we don't frame that to just disabled staff. I think actually the more that we can talk about workplace adjustments just being good for you as an individual and good for the organization to make, I think we'll kind of remove some of the stigma around having workplace adjustments, but also whack up the productivity of everybody. You don't need to have a diagnosed musculoskeletal condition to benefit from a standing desk or from a decent chair, right? And actually we can prevent some of that stuff by being proactive. So I mean, that's what I'd say. I probably would make sure that in the way that you're talking about how people work from home, you just say, look, we can service these things. It's going to take a bit of money, but you'll save more money than you'll lose from sick pay, right?
Yeah.
I think you're right in terms of the point about how you help people to talk about their disability in the workplace. It has to mean something. It can't just be, far too often we see, and I see it in kind of organizations I've worked for in the past, where there's an option on the HR system, you put it in and you kind of are braced for something to happen and nothing happens, and it transpires that it was only used for demographics. You have to make it mean something, even if it's just, you do that thing on the HR system, but then somebody reaches out to talk to you. Somebody reaches out to say, we've noticed you've made a change. Do you need any help? Do you need something to happen? Because I've definitely seen, and I think we saw it through some of the work that you've done, that there's a huge disparity between what organizations know from HR data and what they see through things like employee surveys, where they're asking similar questions, and the disparity, I think, is because there's no reward, there's no benefit for the member of staff telling the organization.
Yeah, that's a really good call, David. We know from our membership how hard it is often for individuals to share information about their disability with an organisation. It can take a very long time, and it can take a wee bit of courage. And when, the wonderful John Armici talks about trust and how organisations need to earn that trust. So yes, of course, individuals can do differently and better and learn as they go along about how to be who they are, how to be, how can they preserve and protect their brand as a high performing employee with a disability at the same time as being who they are. But it's often the case that people will need a bit of courage to share that information formally. And as you call out, then when you've done that, you at least expect, I suppose, the business to then say, okay, so what do you need and how can we help and when do you need it? Yeah,
absolutely. I'm going to move on a little bit to talk just about kind of overlap between accessibility network, or so leadership and networks. Before I do, I think we've got to answer Neil's question about the naming of networks. So, so do you have a particular naming convention that you prefer when it comes to networks looking after disabled staff? And have you come across any networks that you hated the name of, that you didn't like?
Well, and it's a fantastic question. So I'll just say high five over the airways to our wonderful Neil. It's a tricky one. I mean, obviously our membership really matters to us, and we see as many different types of names of networks as there are organisations. I suppose the only thing, so I don't have a favourite is my first answer. I think my advice would always to be not too clever, if I may be so bold, when it comes to disability. And I infamously talk about this in the book, Secrets and Big News, because sometimes we do see organisations who try to be too clever when it comes to the word disability. And we see networks where, you know, there's a lowercase DIS for dis, and then big shouty ability. And I'm being provocative hopefully for the right reasons. What I mean by that is, I personally feel that we don't need to overly prove the brilliance of employees with disability. They were recruited for a reason. Organisations have invested heavily in them, and the cost of a workplace of adjustment is negligible and certainly doesn't exceed that of, say, for example, maternity leave cover. So I would always, you know, on the one hand, notice that sometimes there's a time and a place for being very specific and out about the ability of employees with disabilities. So I'm not suggesting it's the wrong thing to do, but I do like now organisations that choose to use, for example, the colour purple, which is increasingly symbolic of the experience of disability. So my favourites at the moment are Channel 4, for example, the television company in the UK, which is called 4 Purple. Virgin Media, the big global organisation, uses a name called Ultraviolet for its disability network. So we're starting to see that happen in the same way as the rainbow flag has become so centrally emblematic of our LGBT plus colleagues. So too purple is used. So I'm not saying not be playful with words. I'm saying notice the relative disvalue, if that makes sense.
Definitely. No, I agree. I think it's we could get tied in knots, and I think if you have to explain it, then it can be difficult. One of the things that we talked about before we jumped in and looked at some questions was about how networks can help to, I suppose, provide a sense of themes and sort of general helping to scope those areas. I wonder, one of the things that I've been thinking about recently is about what's the role of an accessibility leader to help disability network leaders almost focus a bit, you know, to provide some of that time to be a sounding board and to be, I suppose, a confidant rather than them just having to do it themselves, almost helping to go, well, look, this is what we've got. You know, we've got this side of the table when it comes to accessibility. What we need some help on is this stuff. So almost helping to provide some of that shaping around the role of disability networks in this conversation about accessibility in the workplace.
Yeah, agree. I mean, a number of thoughts strike me when you offer that up, David. I think the first is, of course, we talk about access in the round, and that can mean different things. It can mean access to tech, as well as access to the built environment, as well as access to flexible and agile working policies. So access is, you know, it's a broad term, but that said, there's often what I would call an occupational psychology that sits behind some of the exceptionally gifted access leaders and champions. And what I mean by that is they tend to be, dare I say, without stereotyping access leaders, is they tend to be very systematic in the way that they work. They tend to be those individuals that can do root and branch analysis. They tend to be those that really hone down on what the problem is, and therefore surface what the range of solutions are, and therefore for the business can understand what the best solution is. So the interplay, I think, between access professionals and leaders and champions, as well as the ERGs that work at a kind of broader level, is one, to be able to get the bit between their teeth and really hone down on solutions. They can unblock what I'd call the consistent themes, the challenges that go round and round and round and never get resolved, that maybe surfaced one year, and then 3 years later, guess what the big problem is? It's the same thing that was surfaced 6 years ago or 3 years ago. And some of the greatest access leaders and champions are those that choose to table thump and say, this is not good enough, or not in my name, or leave that with me and I'll go back. So they set the bar high, and as you say, can often counsel and mentor ERG leaders. Does that make sense?
It does. It makes absolute sense, and I think what I've sort of seen, and certainly what I've learned from you know, other folks in this working group, in the IOP, and in similar groups in places like the Business Disability Forum in the UK, and like ILO, for example, the institute, International Labour Organization groups, is that is as much as you get accessibility leaders who maybe come in and have a focus on, say, digital accessibility, we end up, because we're such a passionate bunch of people, we end up getting involved in areas like built environment and you know, it might not be part of our official remit to look at workplace adjustments because that's traditionally an HR thing, but do you know what, we're gonna get stuck in. And I think it comes down to the fact that we live in this sort of like ecosystem of things, and you know, it's no good just to make the digital things accessible if our staff can't get workplace adjustments or they can't get into a building, or you know. So I think increasingly, like I say, whilst people are coming with this digital angle and this sort of tech angle, I'm increasingly seeing, I'm increasingly feeling that actually it's not workable, doesn't stack up like that, because you end up kind of doing half the job really, which is difficult because you end up with with accessibility leaders who are spinning multiple plates. But I think that's where the role of networks then comes in and helps accessibility leaders to go, right, well, I've got all these things, I need you to help me understand what's going on the ground to be able to then go, right, that plate, it's about to fall off, but it's not actually going to cause anybody any problems. Let's deal with this plate that's still spinning and it's going to spin on for a little bit longer, but the second it drops, it's going to break, it's going to smash.
Absolutely.
I wondered as well, and one of the things that I've kind of been thinking about as well is about that kind of useful tension that can exist between networks and accessibility leaders. And thinking about it from the perspective of very often what I've seen and what I know colleagues see is that networks and individuals in networks will perhaps raise an issue that they think affects a lot of people, but actually when you kind of dig under it, it's a lack of understanding somewhere, or it's a you know, it's a challenge that individuals facing because of a specific reason, but that's not been surfaced. So I wonder whether there's whether you think there is a useful tension in being in having them as separate groups and separate entities, and you know, the accessibility leader not leading the disability network or not being on the steering committee, for example.
Yeah, real pros and cons. And I think, like you say, David, I think I'm more inclined to notice the benefits of the creative tension that comes with those two groups and those two issues. We, I mean, as we know, disability inclusion, you know, building more inclusive workplaces is about coming at the topic of disability and ill health from different dimensions and different perspectives. And inclusion can mean a number of things. And part of it is about access to kit, access to buildings, access to technology, access to policies, access to know-how, access to people, we know that. But it's also, inclusion is also about encouraging, in this case, non-disabled allies to be part of our world and notice the relative benefits of recruiting and retaining and developing employees with disabilities. So, you know, I think there's a lot of benefits in disaggregating the responsibilities between the access leader and the ERG leader. But the reality is both are allies of each other. And, you know, so, you know, the reality is all organisations will do it differently. All organisations. We see, for example, sub-networks of user testing, mystery shopping individuals, very patient people who want to be genuinely used to test out kit and to test out technologies, etc. And of course, others don't want to do that at all. They're busy with their day job and they're all right, thank you very much. So yeah, real challenge there, but good challenge, I think.
Yeah, no, I agree. Let's have a look and see. We've got a couple of different questions and points in the sidebar, so let's jump over and have a look. So Mark is asking, is it more common to see disability leadership embedded within the business or contracted outside the organisation as a consultant, which is more effective? Mark, I'd be interested to know if you mean disability leadership or accessibility leadership. Just because I think disability leadership in the context of networks, I'd probably say needs to be in the business rather than contracted out, because it's a volunteer position. So yeah, come back to us with a bit more a bit more information on your question. I'll leave it up for the time being. Ron, how do you find companies working with ERG disability networks in a virtual world? Mostly we focus on meetings, but now everyone has meeting fatigue. Perhaps we need to gravitate to different formats. Certain groups can't meet in real time as well. So what do you see in terms of asynchronous communication and engagement? It's a big word, that.
It is. Great question. Well, look, let me have a tickle of it. I mean, it is a great question. And, you know, I remember back in the day, pre-COVID, just,
Long memory.
We'd often hear from our membership about often how hard it was for them to get together, and to whether they're working on a specific project or indeed it was a genuine network meeting, because so I suppose traditional have we been often in meeting in a physical world and to get together, and very often it was hard for networks to secure the budget that they needed, unlike maybe some of the other sector-specific networks for whom they didn't need some of the extra costs that come when it comes to travelling with disability. I think some of the pluses around this world that we now live in is, you know, although we've reduced the time often that we need to travel, not just in terms of going to a building, but also travelling around a building, and getting ready and glossed up for work. You know, there's lots of time gains. But as Ron so expertly calls out, we've also means that this is an intense world that we now live in. And of course, the temptation now is to start your virtual meetings at 8 o'clock and to keep going and to have no breaks in between. And it's incredibly intense. So I think you're right. I think there is meeting fatigue. I don't think that's exclusive to ERG networks. I think it's per se. And, you know, I see across the board now businesses are starting to think about different methodologies by which they work, and to break things up a bit. A lot of ERGs, for example, won't have seminars or webinars or content. They'll have looser conversations. They'll have a brown paper bag lunch, for example. You just rock up and have a lunch and talk about something that you've learnt in this COVID world. So, you know, it's about mixing it up. I don't know, what would you say, David, on that one?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because the idea of that asynchronous communication is something that kind of continues to bubble up, I think, the longer that we're in this situation.
Yeah.
And, you know, particularly now in the UK where, you know, schools are closed, for example, working parents are, you know, struggling to be in every meeting. So I think if you can, and if you've got platforms and you've got ways of doing chat rooms or those sorts of things, I think it's really good. I think they need to be structured though. I think we need, you know, if you're going to try and run something like an event in an asynchronous way, you need to give people the structure to be able to participate. So whether that's, you know, having some video content that sets the scene and it talks people through, or it's here, you know, you hear from a speaker that's in a video, and then actually there's, you know, 5 questions underneath that people can chat and comment on, then that's great. I think kind of just going, let's go over to, you know, Yammer or SharePoint or, you know, Slack or Teams or whatever it happens to be, and let's just chat. It's not structured enough, and you won't get that level of engagement across the board, I don't think. So yeah, that's good. Let's see who else we've got Jody. The language used is also important. It can be challenging to use language that meets preferences, for example, disabled versus able, differently abled. However, when people use terms like privilege to have adjustments, it can give off a very strong message that doesn't make people feel included. Yeah, absolutely. I think language, I mean, come on, don't know what I'm starting to talk about. Language around disability is such a, it can be difficult to get right, and I don't think there is a right, is there?
No, it's a great question, Jodie, and it's the perennial, isn't it? It's, you know, we look around the world, and on the one hand, this is a classic. We have, of course, the World Health Organization and UN, who will use a common language around people with disabilities, but we do know in other places around the world they choose to do it differently. and for their own right reasons, and often they are political reasons. So it's not necessarily that it's the uninitiated that would choose to use the language of disabled people. So, but yeah, it is hard. I think it's, it's harder because it is a human experience that is so commonly acquired through the course of your life. So you're coming to this human experience and you're trying to make sense of it, as well as to define and brand yourself, as well as what that means in the context of what the rights are. What are your rights? So, but it's a good call, Jodie. I don't think my belief, it'll never be resolved. There isn't a language that will yet have undiscovered, and we will one day. In the context of our conversation today, I suppose, and disability per se, it's about how do we support businesses to use language that just normalizes an experience that is so common, and the work that the Valuable 500 and others are doing to really support that process is extraordinary, but no silver bullet on that one.
No, I don't think so. I think you're right. And you talk about the Valuable 500. We had the fabulous Caroline Casey in the last of these webinars. If you didn't get a chance to go along and see that, it's on the IAP YouTube. One thing I would say though around language is I think if organizations can be consistent in themselves, I think that really helps, particularly in global organizations. I think it really helps to have that shared language globally so that there is parity across the globe and across how you talk about things. Right, time is pressing on. We'll do one more from the questions, and then I want to talk a bit about culture and the role of networks in building culture around accessibility. And let's take the question here about deformalizing the accommodations or the adjustments process being helpful. We talked a little bit about it, but give us your thoughts, Kate, on taking away some of those barriers.
Yeah, it's a great question. Thank you, Lane. I would say there is real merit in, I would say, normalizing rather than deformalizing, although maybe it's the same thing. Because, we do know that in the past there has been an emphasis on, for example, the language of reasonable adjustment or reasonable accommodation, as from the States. And it's often the case that there's very little thought and creativity around what that means. Again, in the book, we called out, if you continue to focus, for example, on the word reasonable, and you always put the word reasonable in front of the words accommodation and an adjustment, guess what people hear, and only hear? And that is the word reasonable. They don't hear that it's an adjective, they see it as a noun. So to come back to the question, I think there's real merit in simplifying processes. The passport, for example, that many organisations use, I think has played a very powerful role in helping people to articulate how their disability impacts in the working environment, the simple solutions that they need, and then take forward those solutions throughout their career within an organisation. I think there's huge merit in deformalising the process by using the language of workplace adjustment. As you say earlier, David, that often plays into other access issues. It's about, not that it's about disability workplace adjustment, it's about any organisation wanting to do the right thing. So yeah, lots of thoughts there. What about yours, David? Merits?
Yeah, no, I think the more that we can remove those barriers, particularly, I mean, I think that Lane talked about, the burden of proof. I think if somebody asks for it, then I think it's great. I think the more that we can just go, look, if you think you need it, have it. I genuinely don't think there's such a thing as adjustment envy. I just don't buy it, and certainly I don't see the research or the backing anywhere that really suggests that kind of envy exists. And I think most people are just interested in doing their best in the workplace, and so the more that we can enable that, the better, I think. Let's turn maybe spend 5 or 10 minutes talking about kind of the culture around accessibility and the role of networks. You've talked a little bit about storytelling, but I wonder what your thoughts are about how that can be used, and the telling of lived experience stories to kind of bring to life the reasons why organizations need to be accessible, not just in their systems, but in their workplace environments, and in simple things like their communications and the videos from the CEO and those sorts of things. So be interested to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, really powerful, really, really powerful, David. I think, telling gritty stories about actual individuals within an organisation can be one of the most powerful drivers, sustain motivation and direction and ambition and standards when it comes to accessibility. So there's nothing quite like, and of course it takes a little bit of practice. Not everybody wants to share their story, and the majority of individuals are continually perfecting the way in which they describe their story of disability or difference. It's never once undone. It's a story of continued practice. But I think where we see really real power is where you can hone down. So somebody's sharing a bit about themselves, a bit about the blocks that they have had, the challenges, the obstacles, the barriers, the inaccessible ways in which the business has interfered in them being productive. The solutions that then came about, particularly the individuals that help unlock those solutions, our champions, our allies, that can unblock that. And then as a result of that, how either productivity went up or efficiency went up, and or one's level of motivation goes up, because of course we will want to work with organizations who want us to do well. So I think storytellings can be an incredibly powerful vehicle and a technique for accelerating the process of accessibility change within an organization. Really, really powerful.
Yeah, and I think certainly from my experience, and we hear it quite a lot when we get asked about how do you help people to see beyond compliance and beyond box checking, and it's very often that the thing that changes people's perceptions and people's approach to accessibility, regardless of what version of accessibility that is watching somebody or being involved with somebody with a disability trying to complete a task, for example, trying to have a look at their payslip, for example, or watch that really important video that lays out the next thing that the CEO wants to do, or simply getting into the building, getting up to their desk, using that newfangled touch screen lift system that nobody thought about how somebody in a wheelchair was going to use, or who was blind was going to use. So I think that's really impactful, and that's obviously another type of storytelling, but it has to be, I think it's about, we have to be careful how we do those things, so that they don't overuse the certain individuals, and we don't overplay somebody's ability or inability to do something, so so people understand that we're not going, this person can't do their job. It's actually we're putting barriers in this person's way, because I think there's a very easy and fine line between those things.
Yeah, absolutely. It's about reframing. I think. Absolutely.
I think as well, we've talked a little bit, you've mentioned a couple of times, and I know that a lot of people use disability networks as a way of finding people to do testing and to get them to do user testing of their systems or of their buildings. I think the one thing that I've kind of realized, come to over the last couple of years, particularly in this role that I have now, actually, is that I think there's definitely a use, there's definitely a way that we can leverage disabled staff to do that. But I think that we have to do two things. I think firstly, we have to make sure that those individuals who are involved in that are trained and skilled in what in their assistive technology and in the types of things that they need to be talking to people about. Very often, what I've seen is, unfortunately, where the individual is using a very sophisticated piece of assistive technology, but actually they don't understand it, and therefore they come up with all these problems that aren't really accessibility issues. It's an issue with their setup or with their knowledge of their system. So I think we need to make sure that the people that we get involved in user testing like that are suitably supported in that way. And I also think that we have to find ways of saying thank you and rewarding them, because it is an extra thing. It's as much as it's good to involve staff that don't have disabilities in that type of work, it doesn't happen very often, because we just roll things out, we just give people stuff. And so that extra thank you, that extra little reward, generally can't pay them in the way that you might pay somebody externally, but I think there's ways that we should reward people who volunteer and take part in that type of activity. And then lastly, I think it shouldn't be the only thing. We should definitely be encouraging organizations to have people doing this as part of their jobs, and making sure that we do it in a way that doesn't rely on the goodness and the kindness of volunteers.
Oh, great tips there, David. I really enjoy hearing all of those. I mean, picking up on your point around thanking people, it can be one of the simplest, easiest things to do, but it's the most commonly missed. We see, for example, in our membership, I mean, we do see some fantastic practice. I just saw the other day, and if you're listening, Sodexo, well done. I mean, we just saw an amazing thank you going out from, senior business leaders to those who are doing a good job in terms of leading ERG networks. And I think when it comes to user testing and mystery shopping and using your own people to surface where there's constant challenges, a simple thank you is just really powerful. It doesn't do it, not everybody wants to be part of that user testing, but for those that do, they are investing their time in the organisation in terms of how it could be doing things differently and better. So simple thank you is very powerful.
Yeah, absolutely. Right, we've got a flurry of questions and about 10 minutes, and I'm really keen to try and get through as many of these as we can in that time. And there's loads of comments going into the chat as well, which if we have time, we'll go and have a look at. But if you've got questions, then stick them in the Q&A and we'll definitely get to them. So let's do Jennifer's. Do you know other organizations? Do you know how other organizations deal with an accessibility issue? Jennifer, I think the way in which organizations are set up to deal with accessibility issues varies greatly, depending on the size of the organization, depending on where it is in its maturity around accessibility, depending on what country they're in. There was a question earlier from somebody whose name I've forgotten. That's really awful. I've forgotten who it was. From Mark about kind of having people in the business or contracting it out of the business, and when we come to accessibility, it's both, right? I don't think any organization is really fully properly set up to do everything themselves, and most organizations, I think, outsource to a certain degree when it comes to accessibility. I think one of the things I've been doing a lot recently is talking to other departments and other public sector organisations in the UK. And the thing that I think is really important, if you are looking to be more mature around accessibility and to go beyond box checking and to go beyond just testing everything that comes through and producing audit reports, or whether that's internally or externally, is that you actually do need somebody to be able to sit down and look at how the organization works and come up with a strategy for how you're going to deal with accessibility. I don't think it's enough to just go, well, it's part of how we build stuff, it's part of how we design stuff, because it just will get missed. And so I think it's really important that we invest in leadership around accessibility in the same way we invest in leadership around design and leadership around engineering and development. So I think that's what I'd say to that one. Kate, the next one's probably best from you. So what is your thoughts on non-disabled people leading support or services for disabled people? Seems to be one of the characteristics that some organisations do not feel it's essential that disabled people are part of the decisions.
Oh, great question. I think let me start with the latter part of that question, then go back to the former. So you're absolutely right. Yes, of course, there are some organisations that maybe are not as progressive in wanting to learn directly from their own employees with disabilities. You actually got to look a lot harder now to find the less progressive. There is a real sea change that we're seeing. But yes, you're absolutely right. There are some organisations that won't learn directly or choose not to deliberately learn directly from their own employees with disabilities. In terms of leading and not leading, I mean, I think it's important to bring people with us. I think it's important to notice the skilled, the passionate, non-disabled allies and champions. We see that with different movements. I think if one chooses to go too fast and not bring allies and champions with us, we do a huge disservice to the huge talent of passionate individuals who have a strong sense of justice and want our worlds to be more inclusive. But absolutely, you know, I'm often asked, let me answer it this way. I'm often asked, is it right for a non-disabled person to lead an employee resource group or network? And my answer is usually the same, which is it's not inherently right or wrong. You know, an ERG, ultimately, their strategy has to be predicated on what are the barriers that disabled people have within the system, and therefore it's entirely proper, essential that an ERG strategy is led by employees with disabilities, part of their agenda. But it may be, for example, that there is nobody wishing to put their head above the parapet. It's incredibly hard to take that role and to have a disability. And some organisations are coming from a wee way back. So that's how I would answer it. You know, yes, it's essential that ERGs are led, I think, by the experiences of disabled people. I think it's essential that businesses choose to learn directly and deliberately. And yet it's necessary and proper to capitalise on the talents and our passion and the strong sense of justice from our non-disabled allies and champions and colleagues. Sometimes it's easier to be advocating for others than it is for ourselves. So yeah, it's all, yeah.
Yeah, definitely. I can see that Carrie has their hand up. Carrie, I don't think I can unmute you. So if you've got a question, stick it in the chat or in the Q&A. That would be great. Oh, and Gloria the same. If it's all right, if you just want to, gone off again. Maybe you didn't mean to. What have we got here? So what advice would you give to someone looking to get off long-term disability that can't go back to their old profession, starting in a new profession and learning with a new disability is often a mountain to climb? Your thoughts, Kate?
That's tough. It's a really tough question, and without knowing the detail, it'd be really hard and wrong for me to give strict advice. I don't give advice. I give thoughts and offerings in terms of what we learn from our growing community. What I would say is I hear you. It's really hard if we acquire a disability. That means we can't go back to our own profession. You know, there's so much that can be done in terms of workplace adjustments and accommodating people of difference after the onset of a disability, so much. But it does happen that from time to time, it means that we can't go back to our profession. It means a period of adjustment. It means a period of reflection. It means doing your homework. It means sometimes learning new skills, whether that be communication or tech. It means reaching out and talking to other employees with others with disability to ask what they have learned, how they've built their confidence and their resilience. So really hard for me to offer up anything of meaning in terms of your questions. What I would say is be patient with yourself, know that you're not alone, and know that there are many, many, many individuals who have navigated and secured a job in a different profession after the onset of disability. Yeah, stick with it.
Absolutely, yeah. Absolutely. I can see in the chat mention of access to work, and obviously that's a very UK specific thing, but there may be things in your geography, in your government that can offer some support as well. So take a look at those. See Michael's mentioning and talking about kind of what we were talking about in terms of members of ERGs not being suitably skilled to do what he calls real accessibility testing, but I think means thorough, deep, expert driven. Which I think I agree on, and I think it's more about how we can help position members of ERGs and networks as users, real users who want to kick the tires and want to kind of understand what's going on and want to be part of the conversation about how they're supported. I think that's the thing that I'm certainly coming to and I've seen is that people know that stuff's not always going to be accessible, because we buy, most organizations buy a lot of their tech, but want to be part of the conversation about how they can use it and how they can be supported to do their jobs.
Yeah, good call. Nothing to add to that, David. Yep, totally agree with you and Michael on that one.
Fantastic. Well, I think we are at the end of our conversation. I think oh, hang on, there's one more. Sometimes volunteering in the role can help you assess your capacity and what adjustments would help. Also linking with other, so sort of some support for that caller around things that they can think about as well. Fantastic, cool. I'm going to bring us to an end because we're a couple of minutes before 3 o'clock in the UK, or to the hour, depending on where you are in the world. Kate, I wanted to say a big thank you to you for so generously giving us some of your time and talking to us about the world of networks, and about that useful opportunity that accessibility leaders have to be closer to their disability networks. Thank you to everybody who's joined us. So lots and lots of people joining us. I think, Rachel, do you want to come back and tell us about the next session that's happening next week?
Yes, thank you so much, Kate and David, for this discussion today. And next week, we will have our third session in the series. It's going to focus on accessibility expertise. And we have Sapash and Jody will be our presenters next week. So we hope to have you join us again then. And just as a reminder, you can continue today's discussion in our community of practice and our members connections community. If you're interested in becoming a member or learning more about IAAP, I'll post that link in the chat momentarily. I'd also like to thank our interpreters today and our captionist for providing those services. And if we will stick around here for another minute or two, if there's any other questions or questions about next week's webinar or IAAP, myself and Tracy are on the line from the IAAP team. Again, thank you, David and Kate, for today's great presentation.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Yeah, take care.